supported only by Admiral Fisher, who was determined to find an adequate oil supply to develop the British Navy. Nearing ruin, Darcy had finally decided to give up the search. But the message he sent from London never arrived, and drilling continued. Then, by a twist of fate, a tremendous explosion shook the region, closely followed by a 15-meter gush of crude oil. The discovery marks the beginning of oil history in the Middle East and saved Darcy from ruin. Whilst celebrating, he is reported to have quoted Psalm 104 from the Bible. He extracts oil from earth to brighten his face.
Well, after Anglo-Persian was formed in 1909, the first imperative was to develop this giant oil field in Iran. This was the first major oil field to be discovered in the Middle East. And Anglo-Persian's real competitive advantage, the real reason it was able to become a big player in the international oil industry, was that it was the first mover in Middle East oil. So the key to its development was to develop the oil field, construct a pipeline, construct a refinery so that products could be marketed to drivers of automobiles which were coming in at the time, to ships and so on. The way that Anglo-Persian developed more specifically was that it became, like other big oil companies of the time in America, like Royal Dutch Shell, it adopted a very similar structure in many ways. It became what we call today a vertically integrated oil company. It engaged in everything from exploring and producing crude oil to refining crude oil and to marketing oil products through its own outlets, that is to say through its own service stations, its own retail outlets, as well as on big contracts to the British Royal Navy and other customers. So it developed a major international presence based on its access to very large supplies of cheap-to-produce Persian crude oil. That was the key.
A few years later, the British government took a majority shareholding in the Anglo-Persian Oil Company on the initiative of a young Navy minister of the time, Winston Churchill. He was certain of the strategic importance of oil in future military conflicts. And when World War I broke out shortly afterwards, he was to be proved right. However, the war began in a very conventional way, with heroic cavalry charges and heavy infantry attacks, the masters of warfare at that time. But in 1914, under threat of German invasion, the French government requisitioned Paris taxis to transport thousands of soldiers to the front line. This event, known as the Taxis of the Marne, saved Paris, largely due to speed of intervention. And so a new era of warfare was dawning. Two years later, following the disastrous Battle of Verdun, military leaders began to understand the importance of mobility in war. The concept of industrial war was based on the use of motorized vehicles such as tanks, lorries, planes and ships that could quickly transport huge numbers of troops over vast distances. Oil became an essential resource for countries at war. The French, who relied on their British allies for oil, were not prepared. Their reserves were running out. In 1917, the head of state, George Clemenceau, was compelled to ask his American allies for help. He sent a telegram to Woodrow Wilson, the President of the United States, and ended with this still famous phrase: "If the Allies don't want to lose the war, when the time of the German supreme shock comes, fighting France should have oil, which is as necessary for victory as blood." 3 weeks later, France received over 40,000 tons of fuel, and the Allied victory was secured just 1 year later with the armistice of November the 11th, 1918.
Cet épisode est un épisode qui a porté ses leçons. D'une part, en 1918, il y a eu un monopole d'importation de l'État pour le pétrole. C'est important, nous sommes dans un pays qui a de tradition libérale. Or, pendant la guerre, l'État prend de plus en plus de pouvoir. D'autre part, les hommes comme Clémenceau, comme Henri Béranger, Louis Pinault, qui étaient préoccupés par cette histoire du pétrole, se sont dit qu'il fallait trouver une solution dans l'après-guerre. Donc la Première Guerre mondiale est une prise de conscience de la France vis-à-vis de sa fragilité quand le pétrole était absolument nécessaire et indispensable, en particulier en période de guerre.
France was eagerly looking for its opportunity to enter the industry. 2 years after the war, at the San Remo conference in April 1920, France's chance finally came when the question of the Turkish Petroleum Company was raised, a company part owned by Germany. The company dated to the pre-war period when Iraq was still Mesopotamia and a province of the Ottoman Empire. A wealthy and accomplished businessman of Armenian origin, Calouste Gulbenkian, saw the region as a plausible source of oil. But with the backing of the Anglo-Persian Oil Company, Shell and Deutsche Bank, 3 companies with very different international interests, the company became dormant when war broke out. When the war was over, the Turkish Petroleum Company was yet to drill even one well. After the Allied victory, the Ottoman Empire, who had sided with the Germans, was to be divided. The French and the English shared the remains of the dead empire. The French took the mandates of Syria and Lebanon, and the English took Palestine and Iraq. But when the fate of the Turkish Petroleum Company was raised, it was Britain that took control, and with it, the opportunity to exploit the oil wealth of Iraq. But the oil-frustrated French put up quite a fight, and after stormy negotiations, France was granted the German portion of the Turkish Petroleum Company as compensation for war damage. This represented 25% and led to the creation of the French oil company CFP, the forefather of Total. However, the United States too wanted their share as compensation for their part in the war, and the existing partners could not refuse. And so a consortium controlled by the British was formed, the Iraq Petroleum Company. It included Shell, the Anglo-Persian Oil Company, CFP, and the American Nedec, each of whom held 23.75% of the shares. As a middleman, Gulbenkian received 5%, which, whilst earning him the nickname of Mr. 5%, made him a very wealthy man indeed. Once the agreement was signed, exploration began. After little success, the search focused on the area around Kirkuk, and it was there, on October the 14th, 1927, that a tremendous rumbling shook the desert. A gush of oil spurted from Baba Gugur well number 1, and it was so powerful that 700 men were needed to stem the black tide threatening Kirkuk. The Iraq Petroleum Company was finally in business. The owners of the company, euphoric at their discovery of the first giant Middle Eastern oil field, agreed they should cooperate all over the region. But the region's post-war borders were still unclear. Gulbenkian is said to have drawn a line with a red pencil. This was the famous red line that followed the borders of the former Ottoman Empire. It included most of the Middle East and the whole of the Arabian Peninsula, where the world's biggest oil fields were yet to be discovered. From the end of World War I, oil caused a fundamental change in international industrial relations, the creation of the cooperative Iraq Petroleum Company being its clearest example. But the United States, the first oil-producing, consuming and exporting country in the world, maintained its supremacy into the 1960s.